Hello everyone, welcome to a new episode of NuReview. Today I am going to be doing a review of Ennio Morricone's 1982 soundtrack to John Carpenter's The Thing. This is a reissue by Waxwork Records that just came out. I actually really love this packaging. I'm a massive fan of both the film. I love John Carpenter. I've always enjoyed Ennio Morricone's soundtracks. The Thing soundtrack is released on June 25th, 1982. And an interesting thing about the soundtrack is that for pretty much every film that John Carpenter had made up to this point, he himself had composed it, whether it had been a film like Assault on Precinct 13 or The Fog, Halloween, Escape from New York. Pretty much all of them he had done the soundtrack for. And then he asked Ennio Morricone to do the soundtrack for The Thing. But John Carpenter does work on the soundtrack in some sort of capacity. He's not officially credited, although both he and Ennio have said that he did contribute to it in some ways. And the soundtrack is not really representative of Ennio Morricone's other scores for films like The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, For a Few Dollars More, A Fistful of Dollars. Those are more orchestral in the way that they are presented, and the music that he has done for The Thing is a bit more in line with the music that John Carpenter himself does, and that it is very minimal. There is not a lot going on, and it's really more about tones and textures and less so about actual melodies and harmonies. So let's start out. The album opens with Humanity Part 1. And we're introduced by this very far off stringed instrument. We do get a few more upfront plucked instrumentation that slowly reveals itself as this very ominous tone builds up underneath everything. The song, like many on here, is incredibly slow in its pace, and it's more about creating a sense of unease, and in that aspect, it perfectly mirrors the film. And we do get some baritone horns that come in as well. Again, they are used less for any melody and more of just creating this very claustrophobic, unsettlednessy feeling. And interestingly enough, there are even full moments of just complete silence here, which adds on to this underlying sense of unease. A couple of more string instruments are introduced before finally we are treated to one of the motifs of the soundtrack, performed on an oboe, I believe. More instruments come in and join it, and then it all kind of fades away, and then we really just get this far off piano keys being played. A cello is keeping tempo, and there's still this kind of myriad of far off instruments that just slowly fade out before we're left with nothing. The second song is Shape, and a low cello line introduces us into the song, followed by a very low horn. The song feels slower than Humanity Part 1. Here we have almost these detuned strings that are accompanying everything, and we do get a plaintive piano melody being played. And the song is a bit more uncomfortable in its approach, in that kind of all of these different instrumental elements that are going on are not really matching each other, both in terms of tempo and key, and they just don't go well together, and it makes it a much more uneasy song than the first one. And really the only instrumentation that does seem to fit in is the string section that comes in about 2 minutes into the song. And then finally we get this kind of off-key piano line to see us out into the darkness. The third song is Contamination, and Contamination opens with this very frantic, frenetic, almost sounds like a plucked stand-up bass, before this whole host of just unsettling strings come in, and they create this very cacophonous effect, and it's one of the most overwhelming moments on the entire album. It kind of creates the auditory equivalent of bugs crawling all over your skin. Now, at barely a minute long, Contamination kind of rejects all forms of melody and harmony and subtlety that the previous two songs had. At least they have the subtlety part. Instead, Contamination is about as nasty of a song as we get on the entire album. And the fourth song is Bestiality, which has a great song title. We are greeted with this lone cello line, which soon is met with more stringed instruments and piano, all of it kind of expanding off of that introductory line. And this song is probably the most traditional sounding song on the album in that there's actually a theme on here. The first sequence is repeated a second time. During the second time, we do get some horns added into this cacophonous mix of instrumentation. And much like Contamination immediately before it, this one really does help to create a very unsettling feeling. The next song is Solitude, which opens with a soft string section, which really is just there to lull us into this false sense of security before a lower string section kind of creeps up underneath it. Sparse piano keys are pressed while a lone horn wails in the distance. And there's definitely a feeling of tension that you kind of wait to be broken as the piano line becomes a little bit more constant. We get a few string embellishments as the song goes on, as well as a couple of moments of complete silence, much like Humanity Part 1, but this song has more in common with the first couple of songs on the album in that, unlike Contamination and Bestiality, which are more about just being upfront and being nasty, Solitude is a little bit more about just creating the sense of dread and the sense of unease. And the final song of side A is Eternity, and we get a lone piano key pressed over and over to introduce us into this song. And we get our first taste of the synthesizer here as it fills in the blanks between the piano keys, really giving this song more of a feel of a John Carpenter solo track. And soon we get another synth line coming in out of the gloom. It's very treated. It sounds a lot like a detuned funhouse instrument. The far-off synth chirping continues. There's kind of this lower registered instrument keeping tempo until all of a sudden this very manic organ sounding instrument comes in, and all of a sudden we're in like satanic church territory. And soon the instruments all fade out until we get what sounds like a radar blip going over and over and over again until you realize that this is the introduction that was played on the piano. Just here, it really just sounds like a radar blip going over and over and over again until the song comes to a close. The first song of side B is Wait. And here we get a group of lone horns in the beginning. They're joined by some woodwinds before this crashing, thudding piano swells up underneath it. And this segues into a haunting string section that goes on for some time before that crashing piano makes its reintroduction. And before you know it, we're just overpowered by this cacophony of strings that soon disappears just as quickly as it made its appearance, until all we have left is this lone cello, which leads us into a more dramatic string section. There is this mounting sense of tension throughout this song, but I don't think it ever reaches the dreadful heights that we've heard before. Next we have Humanity Part 2, which is an extension almost of the first one, although here we get a low throbbing bass line and some synthesizer playing before we're greeted by the strings from the first part. We're treated to more slower, creepier synthesizer lines here. It pretty much sounds like more of the same of Humanity Part 1 until about 4.5 minutes in, this organ just crashes out of nowhere. It's joined by this host of like pulsing and beeping synthesizers coming up underneath it, and it's definitely the single loudest moment on the entire album. And it's also incredibly unexpected, and it really is a nice turn of events after the first few minutes in which it was kind of just more of the same. Next we have Sterilization, which is another keyboard-heavy song. Here we get these ascending and descending synth leads going on over these synthesizer pads underneath them. And eventually that lead is doubled before a very processed synth bass joins in. And again, because of the instrumentation, this song also feels very much like a solo John Carpenter track. And then later we get these very like struck synths coming in, and it gives the song more of a spacey feeling than anything that we've heard so far. Unfortunately, though, this song in particular doesn't really go anywhere, and I really don't think it's very deserving of its 5-minute running length. And the last song on the album is titled Despair, and Despair welcomes us in with these very quaky strings, and like right off the bat, it's a very uneasy feeling song. Far off horns join in, as do more dominant and ominous strings. And closing my eyes, listening to this song in particular, I'm transported to the 1982 film, particularly the part where MacReady is showing the other men at Outpost 41 the body that's been retrieved from the Norwegian camp. And the title of the song really matches the mood of it. I mean, at times this gets so overwhelming, it's very hard to breathe. And of course they saved the best song for last. I would go so far as to say this is my single favorite song on this album. And we get one final scattering of percussion and more horns before finally the strings lay the song to rest. And that's The Thing by Ennio Morricone. So, personal thoughts about this album. I've always been a massive John Carpenter fan. Halloween and Escape from New York have always been favorites. And I did particularly enjoy his couple of solo albums that have come out over the last few years, including Lost Themes 1 and Lost Themes 2. They're very fun albums. And so it's very weird listening to a soundtrack, especially if you haven't seen the movie that it's associated with, because you're not quite sure what the intent of the music is if you don't have the actual moving images to reinforce the songs. However, I would venture and say that Ennio Morricone's soundtrack for The Thing plays better than most of John Carpenter's soundtracks. Now, that's not to say that it's a better album, but the songs themselves, I don't think necessarily need the visual element to it in order to get across the message that they're trying to convey. And that is despair and humanity and bestiality and contamination. I mean, it's a very, it's not for everyone, of course. It's incredibly minimal and almost antagonistic in some points, and it really, you kind of have to throw yourself into it. I don't think that this is a soundtrack that would make good background noise, partly because of just how unsettling some of this music is. It's definitely not my favorite soundtrack that I've ever heard, but despite the fact that this is not really what he's known for, this is probably my favorite Ennio Morricone soundtrack, at least from front to back. Of course, the theme of the good, the bad, and the ugly is always going to be what he's known for, but I think that this collection of songs really does stand up to some of his best works. Now, that's not to say that it's without its shortcomings. There are moments on the album that I'm not very big on. There are a couple of songs that I feel do run way too long. Um, but overall, it's not an unsatisfying album. Looking at the back of it, definitely my favorite songs would be Humanity Part 1, Humanity Part 2, and Despair. Least favorite songs would probably be Wait, Sterilization, and probably Eternity. But again, even the lesser moments on here do still stand up. I think it's a very I think it's a very unique record in terms of its instrumentation. Yeah, I mean, just, you know, The Thing has always been probably my absolute favorite movie of all time. I'm not saying it's the greatest movie ever made, but as far as personal favorites go, The Thing has always had a very unique spot in my heart. Um, Massive horror movie fan, and The Thing to me is kind of the perfect horror film. Um, yeah, I don't, I just, I could go on and on and on and on and on about this album and about The Thing and John Carpenter, but it's a very unique, very rewarding, unsettling, uneasy album to listen to. I would go so far as to give it probably a solid 7 out of 10. And that's my review of The Thing by Ennio Morricone. So, what did you think? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Do you disagree with anything I've said? Do you agree with anything that I've said? Feel free to leave any comments and questions in the comment box below, and I will be back very soon with another review. In the meantime, this is Tyler King of NuReview with Ennio Morricone's The Thing. Uh, yeah, 7 out of 10.